Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to Lawyers Across the Globe and Around the Clock for the Rule of Law. This is our 24-hour webathon, hosted and developed by bar associations and law societies around the world to demonstrate universal support for the rule of law among the world's lawyers. I'm Joe Raia. I'm the chair of the American Bar Association's International Law Section, and this is panel number 4 of 12, brought to you by the American Bar Association. This panel is titled Developing Strategies and Programs to Support the Rule of Law. The rule of law is our foundation for representative government, for economic opportunity and development, and for human rights and universal principles. Lawyers, we are the first line of defense. The rule of law is not merely our stock in trade as lawyers, it is our core value. And the American Bar Association is very proud today to begin our program with keynote remarks from former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, followed by a panel discussion on programs and actions that can support and defend the rule of law. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to the President of the American Bar Association, Trish Refo. I'm not going to tell you all of the leadership roles, contributions to the profession and to the courts that she has made. I will tell you that in these times of pandemic and disassociation, she has brought singularly positive, supportive, and engaging leadership to the ABA. She develops consensus and builds teamwork. She has focused on supporting the rule of law throughout her term as president, in the several presidential statements that have been issued, and in other private letters where she has stood up for the rule of law in the face of serious threats. With that, I'm very grateful for her leadership, and it is my pleasure to say here is Trish Refo, President of the ABA.
Thank you, Joe, and especially thank you for your vision and leadership and that of the entire International Law Section team in producing really a magnificent 24-hour webathon about the rule of law. You know that I have been excited about this program since the day you first mentioned it to me. And it is now my distinct honor and privilege to introduce a distinguished keynote speaker who has devoted her entire career in public service and the private sector to promoting the rule of law globally. Madeleine K. Albright is a professor, author, diplomat, and businesswoman who, of course, served as the 64th Secretary of State of the United States. In 1997, President Clinton appointed Secretary Albright as the first female Secretary of State, and when she was confirmed by the Senate, she became the highest ranking woman in the history of the United States government at the time. From 1993 to 1997, Secretary Albright served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Previously, she served as president of the Center for National Policy, and before that, she was a member of President Carter's National Security Council and served as chief legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Edmund Muskie. Dr. Albright is a professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She is chair of Albright's Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and chair of Albright Capital Management, LLC, an investment advisory firm focusing on emerging markets. She also chairs the National Democratic Institute and serves as the president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation. Secretary Albright is a member of the Defense Policy Board, which provides independent, informed advice to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. As I know you all know, she is a New York Times best-selling author 7 times over. Her most recent book, Hell and Other Destinations, was published in April 2020, and all of her prior books are equally fabulous and interesting. Secretary Albright received her BA with honors from Wellesley College and master's and doctorate degrees from the Columbia University. And on May 29th of 2012, President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor. Secretary Albright, you have been extremely generous with your time for me this year during my year of service as president of the American Bar Association. And on behalf of all of the lawyers in America and around the globe, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Trish, thank you very, very much for that overly kind introduction and for the invitation to participate in this Rule of Law webathon. I must confess that I'm not an attorney myself, but I do feel very much at home because I'm known in my household as the mother of all lawyers. 2 of my daughters have passed the bar, as have 2 sons-in-law. And this means that whenever my family gets together, everyone talks at once. I will add that years ago, soon after she became eligible to practice, my daughter Anne began work in the local public defender's office. And one evening she called to cancel our dinner plans. And when I asked her why, she said, or at least I thought she said, that she was in jail, not just that she was at the jail. So you can imagine how relieved I was when I found that she wasn't actually under arrest, and how proud I was when she became an associate judge in the Circuit Court of Montgomery County, Maryland. And Justice Albright has a very nice ring to it. And I've even fantasized at times about becoming a judge myself. After all, the robes really do look comfortable enough. And because of my height, I could certainly benefit from the raised platforms on which most judges are allowed to sit. And I also wouldn't mind being called Your Honor. After many years of pretending to be diplomatic, I could make excellent use of the gavel. So now, as you might expect, I do a lot of public speaking, but I was especially pleased to accept this invitation because you are a global network that has come together at a critical moment for the rule of law. In recent years, many heads of government have abandoned the idea of global cooperation and instead insisted on going it alone. They argue that interdependence is but an illusion, a theory cooked up by foreign policy think tanks to undermine national sovereignty and cause citizens to betray their own countries and identities. A former US president even declared that people everywhere must choose between globalism and patriotism. The thesis is baloney, but some politicians still find it appetizing because there's no easier way to earn cheers from a crowd than to tell the angry what they want to hear. So rather than explain the world's complexities, they insist that everything is simple and that greatness can be found by boasting about ourselves and ignoring the rights of others. Many of these leaders pretend to be Democrats, but they are really autocrats, eager to stretch their time and power by rigging elections, weakening parliaments, smearing minority groups, trashing journalists, and inciting extremist backers to violence. They're so busy trying to silence opposition at home that they have little interest in joining with others to address the wider problems. Instead, they do all they can to weaken multilateral institutions and to foster the idea that might makes right. And whether their words are in Chinese or Russian or Arabic or Farsi, Hungarian, English, Spanish, Turkish, or Burmese, the meaning is the same. The rule of law is for suckers. The world we want has no rules at all. The consequences are both painful and plain. In many places, democracy is in decline, diplomacy is considered obsolete, and laws are trampled with impunity. Slowly but surely, we have begun to lose faith in the ability of free people to make progress together. Now, this is not the first time such a cynical attitude has taken hold. It was also the case in the 1930s, the decade I was born, and it led then with terrifying swiftness to the Holocaust and war. And we must not let that happen again. Fortunately, there is an alternative, which is where you all come in. Now, I realize that the legal profession is vast and that many problems it must address are more of a practical or technical nature than a moral one. Also, attorneys are not usually independent actors, but instead people with a responsibility to look out for the best interests of their clients. We all have, we all have to make a living, and our particular interests and attributes vary widely. But at the same time, we know, because we've seen how much good lawyers can accomplish when contributing their energy and talents to positive social goals. I've witnessed this myself on many occasions, both domestically and overseas. Lawyers have played a critical role in helping new democracies to draft their constitutions, establish an independent judiciary, and implement legal standards. Lawyers have helped women across the globe to give real meaning to statutes against domestic abuse, sexual harassment, and rape. Lawyers have intervened at considerable risk to protect the victims of human trafficking and underage prostitution. Lawyers have also helped to improve working conditions in low-wage industries, monitor elections in badly divided countries, and blow the whistle on governments that abuse human rights while claiming to protect them. So my message to you is to ignore the cynics. Democracy, though imperfect, remains the best system of government ever invented. The interdependence of peoples is not a fiction, and the rule of law is not for suckers. There is nothing unpatriotic about striving to solve problems across international borders. Yes, it's true that both democracy and international cooperation can be frustrating. Both require that we re-examine our own assumptions, listen carefully to opposing views, and accept compromises that may be less than popular. Yes, there is scarcely a peril facing the world that cannot be eased through effective joint action involving democracies and countries willing to partner with them. And in saying this, I emphasize that defending freedom, securing human rights, and building bridges among nations are duties not just for governments. As Secretary of State, I turn for advice to scholars and business people and labor leaders and activists of every description. And I learned every day of the connections that exist between education and smart choices on the environment, between equal rights for women and the reduction of poverty, between socially responsible investments and the creation of jobs, and between support for democratic values and the building of sustainable peace. Progress is the work of many hands, and legal associations around the world have a critical role to play. Now, I have now been out of office longer than I was in it, actually, more than 20 years. And in that time, I feel as if I've done a little bit of everything. As you pointed out, I've started a business, I returned to teaching, I serve as chair of America's National Democratic Institute, written 7 books, and been involved in task forces on everything, from the need for interreligious dialogue to the future of the Middle East. And in the process, I've traveled to almost every corner of the globe. But wherever I go and whatever I do, the one theme that follows me is the importance of the law. Law establishes the framework for political organization, commercial activity, and social relations. It defines the balance between collective and individual rights. It establishes a connection between each of us and all of us. It is, in short, the cornerstone of civilization. And if that cornerstone is to bear weight, it must have the integrity that comes from legitimacy, consistency, accessibility, and fairness. Building such a cornerstone requires a united effort, and it takes time. 4,000 years ago, a Babylonian leader by the name of Hammurabi issued a law code designed, and I quote, to cause justice to prevail in the country, to destroy the wicked and the evil, and to ensure that the strong do not oppress the weak, unquote. Hammurabi's quest remains a work in progress. Through technology, we have transformed the world, and yet we cannot claim that justice always prevails or that the strong no longer oppress the weak, which means that you and we still have an awful lot to do. We may differ in nationality, ethnicity, profession, and gender, but we have a common purpose, a shared mission to complete. And so in closing, let me say that for all that you have done in the past, in your own way and in our own countries, to advance the cause of true justice, I applaud you. And for all that you are doing at this webathon, I salute you. And for your very warm welcome and kind attention, I thank you very, very much.
Well, Madam Secretary, that was terrific, rousing, and wonderful. If it's possible, even better than I had expected. And I expected a lot of wonderful stuff from you. Thank you again for being with us today. I want to pick up on a couple of the themes in your remarks and ask you, in particular, in thinking about what lawyers and the organized bar can do. How can bar societies, bar organizations hope to influence the decision-making of sovereigns around the world on important issues around the rule of law?
Well, I, excuse me, do very much believe in the cooperation of the public and private sector. That is really kind of the aspect that makes our democracy work, and the role in that case of civil society, that is the people who are represented by a number of different organizations in many parts of the world. I do think, obviously, the bar associations have a crucial role in terms of linking that governmental, the public sector with the private sector, perhaps more than any other kind of organization. But the issue that I have found, because this has been something that I have spent a lot of time on, both when I was in the government and since getting out of government, is how to organize the private and public sector so they actually work together, so that the wisdom and the power of the people that comes from the private sector is translated into action in the public sector. Now, easier said than done, because partially the word organized is the key, frankly, because what we see, and this is true of the bar associations as well as it's true of humanitarian organizations or any kind of organization, is that they're not very organized in terms of, you know, who's doing what. And I noticed that, for instance, there's duplication in some, and then there are lacunae in others where some group is not paying any attention at all. And so I would hope that there would be kind of a way that maybe, and your webathon can have a huge role in this, is trying to encourage and inspire cooperation of the bar associations so that there is some agreement on a goal. I mean, the long-term one is clear, but if there are shorter-term ones, so that action can be operated together, and that is not something that undermines freedom. What it does is really cause organization and dedication. And I think it is important. And I have been arguing for a very long time that in the world today, what is essential is for the private sector, it doesn't matter what kind, whether it's non-governmental organizations or corporations, that they are involved in any discussions early, that they're brought to the table early, and not that they come in as a kind of final thought when the public sector's already made some decisions that are supposed to just be carried out. So I'm very, very supportive of what you're trying to do. I think it's essential in terms of rule of law working.
Well, and lawyers, of course, love to meet. Justice Breyer jokes regularly about how the American Bar Association is, he says something like, the only organization on earth with 200,000 members and 500,000 committees. And so we do have lots of duplication, but it's a challenge all around to make sure that we are working together, all non-governmental organizations and with the government, and sort of rowing in the same direction, if you will. One of the things that I was reflecting on as I listened to your remarks was whether you have any thoughts around the enhanced role of women in government and in law and in other sectors, and whether that has had an impact one way or the other on issues around the rule of law from your seat.
Well, I have spent a lot of time in it, and I've got to say, it's an accident of my schedule today but I just finished doing a wonderful event with the National Democratic Institute, which were around really talking at great length and bringing a lot of a shining light on the role of women around the world in terms of the various groupings of women, whether they be the women in Myanmar or the women in Liberia or the women in the United States. And we were able to honor Stacey Abrams, and it's kind of an example of what can happen when women are active and speak out. I do think the National Democratic Institute and other groups that I'm a part of have made it very clear that democracy works better when women are involved, when women, in fact, run for office, when women's voices are heard, and when women are able to state the case and be supported by men who understand that our societies are really based on trying to get encouragement to those who want to believe in the rule of law and in democracy. And so I think that women's voices do make a difference. I think that when we look at countries that have been run by women, originally they were able to deal with COVID better, whether one's talking about New Zealand or Taiwan or the Nordic countries. But I also do think that this is a generalization, that women approach problems a little bit differently because we do have to multitask. I think we have peripheral vision and are able to understand the consequences kind of 360 in terms of what happens. And also the aspect of having to be the caregiver. So I think these, as I say, are generalizations. Men, I think, are better at thinking deeply about one subject. Women are better at peripheral vision. And I think we need to work together in order to get the best of everybody in terms of getting a rule of law and justice around the world.
Well, and of course, one of the critical pieces of the rule of law is a system of justice that treats everyone equally. And unless we have everyone involved in the justice system in all of its layers, it's going to fail in that regard. Don't you think?
Absolutely, totally. I mean, it is the very basis of it. And I think it is misunderstanding what justice is about if you leave out more than half the population.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fabulously interesting conversation. Wonderful to hear you. You are, as you know, a beacon and a model for all who care about the rule of law throughout the globe. And again, we thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for joining us today.
Well, good luck on the webathon. I think it's a great idea, and I'm delighted that you asked me to participate. And you are truly a great example of doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Now we have to follow that. We have to follow the Secretary now. Here we go. With that, we're about to begin the panel part of our presentation. And before we do that, it's my pleasure to introduce the other two members of our panel. And they will be making their appearance shortly, as we can only do on Zoom and one of these video presentations. First, I would like to introduce Alberto Mora, the Director of the Rule of Law Initiative at the American Bar Association. Alberto directs ABA's Global Rule of Law Initiative. We affectionately refer to the Rule of Law Initiative as ROLI, which is in its 30th year now. He also oversees ABA's Human Rights Center and coordinates ABA's relationship with the United Nations and other specialized agencies and functions. Alberto's work has worked across academia, policy, and the law. At the Harvard Kennedy School, he was a resident senior fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. He served as general counsel for the U.S. Department of the Navy. He also served as general counsel for Walmart International and Mars Incorporated, and also served as a civil trial lawyer in Miami, in my hometown. So we welcome you, Alberto, and look forward to hearing from you. I'd also like to introduce at this time Michael Pates, who's the director of the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights. The Center for Human Rights develops ABA policy on international human rights issues and implements those policies through a number of different projects, which Michael, I'm sure, will talk about. They include the Justice Defenders Program, Trial Watch, which is in partnership with the Clooney Foundation, the Atrocity Crimes Initiative, the Business Human Rights Initiative, the Health and Human Rights Initiative, the Dignity Rights Initiative, and the Human Trafficking Project. Before Michael came to ABA, he had the honor of working with two United States Supreme Court justices, Associate Justice Harry Blackmun and the Chief Justice William H. Rehnquist. And with that, now that we have our panel before us, let's begin our discussion and ask President Trish Refo to begin. Trish?
Well, thanks, Joe. So as I reflect on the theme for today, I wanted to start a little bit around some basic kind of first principles, things that we all agree have to be part of the rule of law, because it's important in our work, especially as lawyers, that we do our jobs to try and strengthen all of the constituent parts that make up the rule of law. So one of the things, for example, that we have to have for the rule of law to function is access to justice. People have to be able to get to a judge in the first place. And in our country, I don't need to, I hope, tell you that we continue to have a deep crisis in access to justice on the civil side. The vast majority of the civil legal needs of working class and poor Americans go unmet every year. And that is something that we simply must continue to work on and to strengthen if we are going to continue to strengthen the rule of law. We are involved in that at the American Bar Association through all sorts of pro bono projects, providing pro bono legal services to folks who need the help. We work on it in terms of providing lobbying resources on Congress for funding for the Legal Services Corporation. And we are also working on it now as states across the country continue to experiment with regulatory reform in terms of how they regulate lawyers, all of which is intended to find ways to improve access to justice. Another component part, as we were discussing with the secretary, is the notion that everyone be treated fairly and equally under the law. And it is self-evident that that issue has been front and center in our justice system and our policing practices for well over a year now. We have huge work to do as a nation still on racial equity and anti-racism in our justice system and in our own profession. And the American Bar Association works in any number of ways in that regard. And one example that I wanted to share was this year, the formation of the American Bar Association Legal Education Police Practices Consortium, which is a consortium now of 56 accredited ABA law schools around the country who are banding together to develop curriculum and develop programming in their local communities for their students and for police officers around modernizing and enhancing police practices in the United States. We continue to have a great deal of work to do in that space. The rule of law also depends on an independent judiciary, obviously, a transparent and independent judiciary that is independent of every piece of the political machinery in our government. That is a critical issue for the American Bar Association, and we work on it and lobby on it on an ongoing and regular basis. It is equally important that our profession remain independent. That is sometimes a trickier issue. We regularly, on behalf of lawyers in the United States, have to address governmental agencies or members of the United States Congress around attempts to put the conduct of lawyers under federal sort of supervision, whether it's with respect to assertions by a particular agency about what attorney-client information a lawyer is compelled to disclose, or whether it is in any of the other myriad ways in which sometimes the government tries to enforce conduct on lawyers. And only the national voice of the legal profession can stand up and address those issues, because we're the only ones in Washington, as opposed to in the state houses around the country, to do that. And it is an extremely important component part of the rule of law. Another and two more final important parts of the rule of law. One is, of course, free and fair elections. And we work on election issues day in and day out, not just in presidential election years, but throughout the calendar cycle. We help in states, we help in local jurisdictions. We work this past year, for example, to make sure that lawyers volunteered to serve as election judges or whatever the similar entity is called in your respective jurisdiction, not on anything partisan, but simply to make sure that the laws as they exist are enforced and people who are entitled to vote are allowed to vote without barrier or impediment. And finally, accrediting law schools. I just wanted to throw that out there because that is such an important function of the American Bar Association, accrediting our law schools and making sure that we are training up the next cadre of defenders of the rule of law, because lawyers obviously have a special role in defending the rule of law, but training up that new cadre of lawyers is deeply important, and in a pandemic, kind of 3 times harder to do and to do well. So those are some of the things that I think are important in any rule of law system, and what we're doing about those things here in our own country.
Thank you, Trish. As we talk about rule of law, we so often get focused on the issues of the day, and appreciate you pointing out the institutions underlying the rule of law and how they're just as important in order to keep it, in order to give it ongoing support on a day-to-day basis. Thank you. Alberto.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with Trish and with you, Joe, and with my colleague, Mike. I'm Alberto Mora, the Director of Global Programs for the American Bar Association, and I'll be talking a little bit about what the Rule of Law Initiative does to help promote the rule of law overseas. But first of all, let me just say a word about the state of the rule of law globally. You know, we talked about it, Secretary Albright talked about it, but we know the rule of law is under stress around the world. The noted human rights organization Freedom House issues an annual Freedom of the World report, and in this last report, 2021, they've indicated that 2020 was the 15th year of consecutive decline in the rule of law around the world, with 73 countries, according to their assessment, experiencing declines in the quality of the rule of law in those countries. Similarly, our sibling organization, the World Justice Project, which the ABA helped create some years back, issues an annual rule of law index, and their report in 2020 indicates that for the 3rd year around the world, there's been a negative slide towards weakening and stagnating in the rule of law around the world. Even the United States, according to their assessment, lost ground in the rule of law over the last year. So this is the situation in which we find ourselves. And the ABA is committed to helping strengthen the rule of law, as Trish mentioned, at home and certainly abroad as well. Let me start a presentation for you that will give you a few some data on what ROLI does around the world. So I'll talk primarily about ROLI, but let me touch also on the ABA Center for Human Rights, and Mike Pate is the director of the center. He'll give you a lot more detail about what they do. But the Rule of Law Initiative, what we do is we help build institutions. We help build capacity around the world. And over the 30 years of our existence, we have worked in more than 100 countries and have implemented more than 3,000 programs in these countries. Mike's organization, as he'll explain, works to advance human rights and to create policy both for the American Bar Association on Human Rights and other institutions. There are many other institutions, though, in the ABA that are active in the rule of law. Joe's organization, the Section for International Law, has been a preeminent institution in the country in helping strengthen the rule of law overseas, create international norms, and has a strong opinion in American legal conduct around the world. Now, ROLI, as I mentioned, we work to strengthen legal institutions, strengthen legal professionals, foster respect for human rights, and advance public understanding of the rule of law. We really cover the waterfront when it comes to working in the rule of law sphere. And these are some of the ways that we promote around the world. And I'll mention some of these more particularly in the presentation. Our program areas deal with governance and justice system strengthening, human rights and access to justice, transition, conflict mitigation, and then inclusive and sustainable development. And this is some of our history. I won't go through all these details here, but worth noting that in 1878, the year that the American Bar Association was founded, the association created a committee on international law, the precursor for the section of international law that Joe leads today. And it's indicative of the ABA's also focus on international law as part of its mandate. In 1990, the Central and Eastern European Law Initiative was founded as the Berlin Wall came down, and all those countries were busy reconstructing their legal systems and the rule of law in those countries. ABA members, volunteers, traveled to some of these countries, started working with lawyers, law firms, ministries, parliaments to work on the rule of law. And then over time, that effort became formalized under what is CELI in 1990, and then now ROLI, our organization. We are currently working in 47 countries, and this map will give you a detail on when we're active. So from our start in Eastern and Central Europe, ROLI then expanded to other areas of the world, and were consolidated about 10 years ago into ROLI. So these are just few examples out of the more 3,000 cases that we've worked on, but freeing slaves in Mali and Mauritania, actual individuals that were held in slavery and detected due to the efforts of ROLI. We're very active in women's rights and fighting against gender violence. In the Central African region, we have helped more than 11,000 survivors of sexual violence gain access to justice in a variety of countries. In China, a country where we used to work in, we were instrumental in helping build the first legal capability of private lawyers to work on behalf of LGBT individuals and to defend their rights in Chinese courts. In Europe and Eurasia, we worked in Armenia and in Turkey, for that matter, as well, helping establish the rights for Syrian refugees in those countries and maintain their human dignity. In Central America, when we've been working again over the years in several of the countries, we trained over 7,300 justice sector actors to strengthen their forensic legal skills to help identify and obtain justice for the victims of the Contra wars that plagued that region of the world. In Egypt, trained more than 2,500 Egyptian judges and over 1,000 Egyptian prosecutors to prosecute cases against the perpetrators of gender-based violence and to help the victims. And we support bar associations. This is something we do, obviously, and given our core nature and our sense that for the rule of law to exist, independent lawyers have to be able to function, and bar associations have to defend the individual lawyers and the legal profession generally in these countries. The work we've done for the Georgia Bar Association, the Vietnam Bar Associations are two examples of the work we've done around the world. In legal education, Trish mentioned that in the United States, we certify law schools. We have worked law schools and helped law schools all over the world, strengthen their curriculum. And in Mexico and in Colombia, and more Mexico now and in other countries, we're working on the mock trial programs, which have been so successful in helping build individual legal skills and then develop courtroom skills that have strengthened the legal system and the countries where those programs are in effect. In Colombia, we're working with the Judicial Training Institute to help restructure the curriculum that trains all of the judges in that country. I've mentioned the rights of women, and this is one of the signature areas in which ROLI concentrates around the world. In Tunisia, for example, we're working with the Ministry of Women's Affairs to help identify violence against women, strengthen women's inheritance rights, and simply strengthen women's legal rights across the board in that country. And with respect to future challenges in the rule of law, so this list provides some of them. I've mentioned about the stress which the rule of law is under the world, but these are some of the areas where we're focusing. I'll touch on the issue of corruption. We believe that corruption is becoming more of a threat to the integrity of the judicial system and the legal system, and more of a threat to democracy globally. ROLI is already devoting a good bit of attention to the issue of corruption, working with partners around the world to help strengthen the fight against corruption. And this will represent, I think, just a brief introduction to what ROLI does. Again, we work with partners all over the world. We look forward to working with you and your bar associations in joint projects. And thank you, Joe, for the opportunity to present on ROLI.
Still muted, Joe.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
It captures the imagination when you talk about building institutions and building infrastructure, if you will, for the rule of law. So many of us in the section are focused on education and calling attention to things. This is really ambitious, an ambitious part of ROLI's work, and how I understand that you are looking at ways at evaluating effectiveness and efficiency in your approach to building this infrastructure and these institutions. Is that so?
That's right, Joe. This is a central element to ROLI. We wish to be our own most severe critics in terms of, are we being effective? Are we carrying out the funders' intent when they grant us funds to carry out these kinds of programs? And are we working effectively on behalf of our partners overseas to achieve their objectives as well? ROLI only works when we're invited by a local partner to assist them in helping strengthen the rule of law. So being effective and spending our funds wisely and then having the desired impact is critical to our mission.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael, you're next.
Thank you, Joe.
Talk to us about the Center for Human Rights.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Alberto, Trish. Thanks so much, as always, for your leadership. Great honor to hear from Secretary Albright as well. And let me thank the organizers and section staff as well, particularly Christina Hyde for her great work. As Alberto mentioned, I'll pick up where he left off in the Center for Human Rights. And as he noted, the center starts, as do many ABA entities, as a policy shop first. We develop ABA policy on various human rights issues. And then once the House of Delegates adopted this policy, then we have the ability to try to effectuate the policy in any number of ways. And the Center for Human Rights does that primarily through initiatives that are thematic, under which various projects that we work on are organized. Joe mentioned them earlier in the introduction. The first one, and our most important one really in terms of number of staff and the funding, is the Justice Defenders Program, which is our global human rights defender support project. It's now 10 years old. It's in its 10th year, celebrating our 10th anniversary since 2011 in September. And it essentially is a crisis response operation for human rights defenders, and operates in any number of ways to try to protect human rights defenders who are putting life and limb on the line to protect the exercise of human rights, essentially. And so that covers individual civilians to judges to lawyers organizations around the world. And essentially what we do in that program is identify talent across the world and try to deploy it for a very specific purpose as defined by the problem that we're presented with. And so we incorporate a pretty enormous network globally of lawyers and other advocates and organizations to do that. And then the staff of CHR also do a lot of the work behind the scenes in terms of anything from brief writing to white paper writing to largely report writing. We take a lot of the data we get from people we've deployed to specific problem situations and write about the issue. Often it's addressed directly to governments. Other times it's simply a public description of the problem and how it abrogates international human rights law. And we've, been pretty proud, I think, of our effectiveness over the years. We've helped thousands of human rights defenders now over the last 10 years. And you mentioned monitoring and evaluation. We take that very, very seriously. It's built into the program. And we have independent evaluators come in and assess the effectiveness. And what we've been most effective at, and I think this is probably true for most groups that do the kind of work we do, it's not about having a dramatic outcome where the human rights defender is released from prison and is able to live a perfectly unfettered life and career advocating for human rights. It's trying to improve his or her situation, trying to mitigate the stress they're under, the oppression they're under by their particular government. And so that can mean anything from, removing them from a military court and prison to a civilian one where the conditions are better and their health can improve, for example, to any other number of other, outcomes that help improve their situation, help them to fight another day. So I'd be happy to take more questions on that as we go. A corollary project that is now just a couple of years old is called the Trial Watch Project, which we're doing with the Clooney Foundation for Justice. And it involves primarily trial monitoring globally. And that was always a facet of justice defenders, but Trial Watch is dedicated entirely to trial monitoring. And we're working with the foundation to try to systematize trial monitoring worldwide and thereby strengthen fidelity globally to international fair trial standards. And again, a big part of that work is issuing reports that give governments and their judicial systems a grade, anything from A to F, in terms of how fair the particular trial was and what it says about the system in which the trial was conducted. We've just renewed with the Clooney Foundation for Justice for another 2-year round of that particular project, which we think will be expanding pretty aggressively. So that's one of our newest projects and one of our most exciting in terms of its impact. We found through careful analysis that trial monitoring is actually one of the most effective ways of advocating for human rights. Putting somebody in the courtroom to show that the American Bar Association, in our case, is present, as observing the proceedings in relation to international fair trial standards. Many governments and judicial systems, even if they're not fair, want to be perceived as being fair. And so again, it's often a situation where if we're there with other organizations and issue a report that indicates things aren't so hot in that particular judicial system, the person who was on trial or the group that was on trial, their situation somehow dramatically will improve. They'll be released or they'll be let out on bail, for example, and live to advocate another day. And so that's, again, one of our measures for effectiveness in the work that we do. And then we have other initiatives that are also policy-based. Atrocity Crimes Initiative is working on atrocity crimes and prevention. We have an international criminal court project, which seeks to enhance the effectiveness of the ICC, working directly with the organs of the court. And also a Crimes Against Humanity working group working on domestic legislation in the United States to close a gap in the law that doesn't effectively recognize crimes against humanity. Another is the Business and Human Rights Initiative, which is, I think, in many ways, one of our most creative projects, in the sense that, as Secretary Albright mentioned, lawyers are a tremendous link between other sectors of society, of civil society. As particularly, the C-suite in corporations and the general counsel of corporations, in-house counsel, have a symbiotic relationship. And therefore, the ABA can often enhance that symbiotic relationship by bringing human rights concerns to the fore in the business and human rights context that end up being, hopefully, and we're seeing increasing that it is, being brought to bear in executive decision-making on human rights concerns. But the creative power of the private sector in general, if we as the American Bar Association and the legal profession more broadly can help catalyze that creative energy in a way that's ever more consistent with human rights principles, the potential to advance human rights quickly on a relative scale and permanently is just enormous. So we're very proud of that project or that initiative. And then the Health and Human Rights Initiative is one of our newer ones. And that I would highlight one of the projects under that initiative is the Public Health Legal Services Research Project. And this gets to the point that Trish was making earlier about access to justice domestically and access to lawyers to effectuate an access to justice. That particular project is examining through research the effectiveness of lawyers in positively impacting community health and social determinants of health. And if the data show what we think it will show, we may have an opportunity to present new arguments to advocate for subsidized legal services, which of course the ABA has championed for 50 plus years. Adding an argument that is not simply a poverty-based argument, but also a public health-based argument, pointing to the impact that lawyers in the legal profession can have in improving public health. And then our last and newest initiative is the Dignity Rights Initiative. And that flows from a policy that the House of Delegates adopted in August of 2019, which essentially tries to emphasize that human dignity is at the core of a just rule of law. The idea being that if a just rule of law is the most effective way, as you alluded to, Joe, for human flourishing, and rule of law is, or I should say human rights are sort of the lifeblood of a rule of law, then it's fair to say in the House of Delegates essentially recognize that human dignity is the lifeblood, if you will, of human rights. And so what that initiative tries to do in any number of ways is to emphasize that human dignity is in fact at the core of a just rule of law, and to emphasize that in a variety of ways so that it's sort of a constant reminder for lawyers in the legal profession, whether you're a tax lawyer or any lawyer in branch of law that you may not typically associate with human rights or rule of law or human dignity. In fact, that thread runs through all of it. If your practice is about doing the right thing under a just rule of law, zealously representing your clients in whatever facet of law you're involved in. And then one I also didn't mention in the introduction, Lawyers Without Rights initiative that Bill Choik of the ABA staff is a key staff person in erecting, is a historical project that draws from the experience of lawyers in Berlin and Germany during the Third Reich, and how Hitler and the Third Reich essentially, one of their first priorities was to attack lawyers in the judicial system, which of course freed up the many disasters and horrors that came later. And so we recognize that sort of history as a sort of historical foundation for the kind of things we're doing across our initiatives, including the Justice Defenders Program, where we help lawyers who are currently facing similar forms of oppression. So that's the Center for Human Rights in a nutshell.
Thank you, Michael. And with respect to the trial watch work that you do, we know that other groups, other organizations have volunteers that go and participate in trial watch type of activities. And can you talk a little bit about how do you do that? What standards are you will apply to your work and that you hope to apply to the trials that you're observing? And how might that change depending on whether the host state is a party to certain conventions or not a party to certain international conventions?
Well, starting with the law, as you know very well, there's sort of black letter international law, and then there's customary international law, which has essentially the effect over time of having very similar import, if not identical weight. And so we start with what the issue is, what who we're trying to support, who's on trial essentially for being a human rights defender in whatever form. And a lot of that involves, number one, being able to get into a courtroom, which is often very difficult. And so we work our networks beyond the legal profession, but on the ground networks to see if we can find a way to get into the courtroom physically. And if we can, we'll identify somebody who has the linguistic talent, a sense of the applicable law in country, because that's also just as important as the applicable domestic law. And are conversant and have that kind of background to be as effective as possible within the courtroom in terms of observing what they're witnessing. So it's those sort of anchor kinds of pieces of background and ability that we look for as a threshold matter. But oftentimes you can't get into a courtroom, but you do have access to documents. And so we also, through our very vast network, try to find folks who are ready and willing and available to analyze the kind of data that we are able to gather about how the trial's proceeding, and whether sort of standard elements of a fair trial are met or not met. And we'll have them do the analysis. Typically, they'll write a preliminary report about what they've witnessed, by way of the documents. And so it's, in terms of attracting that kind of talent for that kind of work, it's those sort of nuts and bolts that we look for. And it's also availability. That's why we need quite a large network, because, folks are doing this on a volunteer basis, have day jobs and careers, and they're not always readily available at the drop of a hat. And that's also a feature of this work where, we find out a very late date when a proceeding has been scheduled, whether it's just a piece of a trial or the full trial. And so we try to anticipate those kinds of things, but we also need people to be able to go when you can travel, again, on a moment's notice. So there's a lot of sort of prep work that goes into that, and having people who and trust can meet those needs are obviously ones that are particularly useful to the trial watch work.
Thank you.
Can I just add a word about this, because this is such important work, and I am so proud of our Center for Human Rights and what they do. And I just want to say, if those of you watching out there have never read one of these reports, do it. It's just remarkable work, and you will see the care that goes into the preparation of this. You will see the rigor with which these reports are sort of vetted and laid out. And the most important thing, in addition to having the person on trial know that we're there and whatever comfort that gives to the human being involved, the most important thing is shedding light on what's happening and helping to bring to the world a spotlight on a place that would otherwise be completely dark. It is incredibly important and fabulous work. And if someone could put in the chat a link so that folks can see some of these reports, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Trish. And let me also add that the International Law section and others are very key in sort of helping us refine that work before it goes out to the public, and they make it even better. So thank you for that.
It's the rigor in all of this work that cuts across all of the work of Rowley and CHR, and also in the president's office. Before anything comes out of the president's office, a number of expert eyes have looked at the work, given serious consideration to the applicable legal standards and also to the facts, the sources for the facts. And that all goes to a standard of excellence that cuts across this association. And before we continue the open discussion, I wanted to take a few moments, because my perspective as chair of the International Law section is, although we're focused on the same goals, we have different assets and we do things a little differently. We're an organization comprised of volunteer lawyers, about 11,000 of us from over 100 different countries, but we are again, looking to accomplish the same things with respect to the rule of law. When we talk about the work of the section, we like to think that we're focused on developing the expertise of our members and also international lawyers in general, in helping them to cultivate relationships around the world with other professionals and the development of international law. This mission all serves the rule of law. It's just basic core competency isn't really enough. You want to develop a network of first-in-class lawyers working with the rule of law around the world. In our section, our members that really represent our greatest assets, their practices cut across private international law, public international law, and the like. So their interests again support the rule of law through their daily work. The core competency comes to the fore when we have acute issues and acute problems, in particular, the threats that have been alluded to by Alberto in particular, we all are aware of those threats to the independence of lawyers and threats to the judiciary, whether they are inspired by autocrats looking to consolidate their authority, or whether it's the result of the nativism or populism that was alluded to by Secretary Albright. The fact is that more and more these days we see more lawyers at risk, more judges at risk, more civil rights defenders at risk, whether these risks come in the form of disbarment or arrest in criminal prosecution or imprisonment. We see more of it, and it's of great concern not only to the ABA, but to law societies around the world, and another reason why we speak more and more to each other about these issues. And it's not, I don't mean to only talk about other countries. Even in the US recently, we saw a lawyer who represented the former president of the United States in an impeachment proceeding. The word traitor was written across his driveway. Perhaps that's a peculiar US tradition of vilifying lawyers for who they represent. But nonetheless, it's a problem that is an implicit threat to the rule of law. And women's rights activists remain at risk. We saw Alberto touch on the great work that Rolly has done in support of women. We note that this past year, we saw the celebration of the 19th Amendment in the United States, where women were given the right to vote, at least on paper at that time. But it makes us remember that 100 years ago, women suffragists were arrested for picketing at the White House and were put in jail and ended up on hunger strikes. And even today, we look around the world and we find women's rights activists arrested and put in jail and on hunger strikes. This doesn't seem to be a new story when it comes to women and advocating for their positions in the world. So with that, I have to say that much of the work that our section does is driven by our members. Members are a part of the ABA and a part of law societies and bar associations in general because they understand and believe in the core values of the organization, because they understand that collectively they're better off in the organization working with colleagues than they are alone somewhere else. So there's a great synergy between our members and leadership. Their expertise around the world, by country, by jurisdiction, by legal expertise, informs their interests, and they bring those interests to us, and we are better and richer for it. And as Secretary Albright suggested, now more than ever, cooperation and collaboration amongst the international law societies, the different bar associations of the world, now more important than ever. Hopefully we can get better through that collaboration to take a more long-range view of issues and how to respond to issues. If we're limited to responding on an ad hoc basis to threats to the rule of law, we won't be as effective as if we can take a longer view on how we might approach these things. So this webathon is a wonderful example of well over a dozen law societies coordinating and collaborating and working together. We learn from each other. The Law Society of England and Wales is a leader on some of these issues, and it's a pleasure. I learn whenever I have an opportunity to speak with them. It's also an opportunity for us to share scarce resources and to pull them together to see what we might be able to accomplish. And probably more than ever, there's arguably an educational issue. Does the general public appreciate how threats to the rule of law can impact their lives, can impact economic development and their very own civil rights? Together, as groups of organizations around the world, can we do a better job of leveraging social media? Can we do a better job of working together to commemorate important days like Law Day, which happened just a few days ago, and identifying other important events that we can acknowledge and thereby support the rule of law, how we can find ways to speak together in one coherent message. And so with that, I would simply say that bar associations, by doing what we do, we support the rule of law, and then we can do better in addressing these more acute threats, these more difficult issues, if we work together and of course listen and respond to the requests of our members. With that, what I'd like to do is to ask of the panel whether they see a difference amongst lawyers themselves when it comes to the threats to the rule of law. Do the human rights lawyers, they get it, but do the commercial lawyers, the private lawyers, do they see it? Is there a difference amongst the lawyers in the world and the lawyers in the US? Are we all seeing the very real challenges to the rule of law that Alberto described? And with that, Trish, can you talk about that first?
Sure, you give me the easy question first. The answer is sort of, right? I mean, I hope that all lawyers share in some of the deeply held and deeply rooted rule of law concepts that we've been talking about today. I think the challenge in our country is twofold. One, we continue to have a civics education gap, which creates challenges among our non-lawyer citizens in understanding some of the issues that support and are foundational to the rule of law. And secondly, as with everything else, regrettably, at least in our country, at this particular moment in time, everything seems to be seen through a partisan lens. And that has a deeply challenging consequence, I believe, for our institutions of justice and for the rule of law. It cannot be the case that we view any court's decision starting with the result and then going backwards to decide whether, after we know the result, was it a good opinion? Was it an opinion that we choose to abide? Right, under the rule of law, everyone is free to disagree with a court's decision, but we are not free to disobey it or to disregard it. That is, a cornerstone of the rule of law. And we have, in recent months and years, seen so many partisan tinged issues be pushed in a way into our court system that we have created for ourselves our own challenge around whether our courts are seen as being nonpartisan. And we need to continue as lawyers to make clear to people who are not lawyers that our courts are not partisan institutions. They are rule of law institutions, and there's a big difference. And I personally believe that that also means that lawyers who are speaking on matters in the public square, on matters of public debate, separate from whatever court rules and professional responsibility rules and stuff apply, those lawyers have a moral responsibility to speak the truth at all times. It is never okay for a lawyer in the public square talking about a matter of public interest to utter a statement that that lawyer knows to be false. And we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, all of us, in how we behave to support the rule of law.
That's, you no doubt, lawyers need to, we're expected to be zealous advocates for clients, but implicit in that is this obligation of being truthful. Otherwise, where do we end up? Alberto, and Any thoughts? There are a couple of things in there. I started off by asking whether we see different parts of the legal profession perhaps unaware of the threats that we're seeing to the rule of law. And then Trish brought us right home to the fact that that in our daily conduct, the way lawyers conduct themselves, this has a direct influence on the rule of law and its perception of the general public. And your thoughts?
Jenna, this is such an interesting question, because as I've traveled around the world, not only for the ABA, but as a private sector attorney, and both in private practice and as a corporate general counsel, what I found that there are variations, of course, but at the core, lawyers are the same. There's a brotherhood and sisterhood of lawyers in the law, in which is remarkably uniform at the top levels of the profession. And I'm thinking of one particular anecdote. I was traveling in an Asian country and met with the president of the Bar Association in that country. He was reluctant to meet with me at first, but then he says, "Okay, come on in and let's talk about this." And when we started the conversation, his voice was actually trembling. And the reason it was trembling is because in his country, there was a push against drug dealers and the drug trade in the country. And the government had targeted lawyers who represented accused drug dealers. And in fact, as the president told me, about 10 of his lawyers had been murdered because they were representing defendants in drug cases. And he indicated that the president had called him out by name twice. And as we were sitting in his office, his dilemma was, how does he protect himself and his family against these threats? And how does he weigh that against the duty as president of the Bar Association to stand up for the rule of law, defend his attorneys, and defend the rights of the accused? So we were in his office, and he was making what could have been a life or death decision for him. But you could tell that he was very conscious of his legal duties and his obligation to the rule of law, and he was determined to do that. That's not all lawyers, certainly lawyers rarely in the United States face that kind of dilemma, but our colleagues overseas do. And his parting words to me says, "I may be calling you because it could be they will need the help of the American Bar Association if things turn worse." As an example, a very dramatic example of the similarity of legal obligation and duty to the profession and to the rule of law, and to the dilemmas that we face as lawyers defending clients, often unpopular clients around the world.
You relate that story, and I immediately think of that old movie, I'm showing my age, A Man for All Seasons, and Thomas More, the dilemma that he faced hundreds of years ago. And here we are in the 21st century, and lawyers are living that dilemma again, where they are confronted between ethical responsibilities in their role as lawyer and threats from the state that could be that could be dire. And it just doesn't cease to amaze me. Michael, again, you've devoted your entire career to civil rights and human rights. Do you think that all of us in the profession, that the corporate and commercial side gets it when it comes to the threats to the rule of law?
I think Trish is right. It's sort of a mixed bag, right? It depends. I think lawyers tend to have individual perspectives in their politics like everyone else does. One hopes that their sort of overlay understanding of the law, which should be better than the typical citizen's understanding, would prevail. One of the things I've been quite gratified to see, when we talk about the legal profession, it's not just lawyers per se, it's judges, it's law schools, it's law students, it's the entire profession. And what I was particularly pleased to see in the 2020 election and the aftermath was that the profession, if you will, held. The judges applied the rule of law to the facts presented, such as they were, and it was an overwhelmingly powerful rejection of bad litigation. And that's what judges are supposed to do, right? And so whatever their personal political persuasions. They did their jobs as judges. And what I would like to see more of is lawyers in the profession explain why that happened, why the judges did what they did, and what the rule of law means from a judge's perspective, at least as we understand it in the United States. Just help try to eliminate any perceptions of partisanship or other sort of notions of conspiracy in the federal bench that prevented a result they might have preferred. But that's the key also to the rule of law. It's not just about the law. It's not just about lawyers. It's about, the key protection to me, there are two key protections. It's an independent judiciary and an independent press. And those are two things that we in the Center for Human Rights also very much aggressively protect or try to protect. There are judges and judicial systems in Europe, Poland being one of the most obvious examples, where they're backsliding on judicial independence. Same in Belarus. And Trish and her predecessors have been very good about, trying to shore that up and work as a joint profession, a sort of global profession, what the rule of law stands for and what it means. And so I think, this is a time where whatever your particular area of practice, there are ways where lawyers can find opportunities and should seize those opportunities to explain the basics of what the law is about, what the role of judges is, what the role of lawyers is on either side of an issue, and why outcomes, particularly those which are hot button issues right now, were correct and fair under the law.
Well, and to the extent that the rule of law is, as we've been discussing, partly about free and fair elections, to the extent that it's partly about racial equity and treating people equally, I do think you've seen more sort of establishment, if you will, institutions of the law stepping forward and saying, yeah, us too. And those, to my way of thinking, are very directly rule of law issues. When you see the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance, for example, major law firms around the country banding together to say, no, this is something we're going to work on. When you see general counsel saying similar sorts of things around the importance of diversity in our own profession, because if the legal profession doesn't look like our country, we have a rule of law issue there in that, right? Embedded in that. So increasingly, I am seeing more corners and pieces of the profession step forward and say, if you will, us too, we're with you on these things.
And I would just add, that's the power of advocacy. Stacey Abrams is a phenomenal advocate, and she marshals resources and arguments and minds together to produce the result that she perceives as the most fair for the most people under the law. That's the kind of advocacy that the American Bar Association is trying to help foster and protect globally. The opportunity to seize that advocacy mantle and improve human condition, if you will.
Joe, you talked about also the role of the lawyers in companies and civil law areas, and lawyers there have an important role to play in helping protect human dignity as well. And many of them, general counsels and attorneys and corporate law offices, are grappling with that problem every single day. Problems of supply chain at the very bottom of the supply chain. I remember as a corporate general counsel looking at the issue of child labor in cocoa producing regions of West Africa and visiting farms of cocoa farmers on the edge of destitution. They just one bad crop away from poverty and disaster for their families. So you see these farmers cutting open cocoa beans with their machete and bare hands, and have a son or a daughter who they'd like to go to school. But on the other hand, if one of the father or the mother falls sick, who's there to help bring in the crop? And you see them wrestle with the problems of child labor. On the one hand, they want their children to escape from the dangers of cocoa farming, and on the other hand, they have to make an income in order for the family to survive. So for a corporate general counsel in that kind of position is, how can we help these families then escape from the kind of economic trap they're in, how can we make real the prohibition against child labor? How can we help them educate their children and improve their situation? These are not only legal issues, although at some levels they're purely legal issues, but they tend to be a combination of politics and law and economics and business for those things. And these are areas where ABA lawyers and members are involved in thinking through those kinds of issues on behalf of their clients all over the world.
It forces us to get, in a way, behind the rule of law to determine what the rules ought to be. Really, the policy underlying the rule of law. We've kind of are we not? We're not necessarily advocating what the existing rules are, but we are looking for new rules to affect more fundamental policies. No?
Right, and I agree with that, but I also think it's important, and this is part of this conversation, that
Yeah.
we acknowledge the challenges that we have ourselves in our own country around accomplishing the sort of the goals of the rule of law, and figuring out how to be honest about the work that remains for us to do, while we also talk about the work that other countries need to do, is, I believe, an important part of this challenge. This crowd all know that one of the most challenging set of remarks I had to give this year, at least so far, was about a week after January 6th. And it was delivering remarks at the opening of the legal year in Hong Kong, where there are any number of issues and concerns with respect to the rule of law. But I was to give remarks about the rule of law less than a week after we had had an insurrection and an attack on our own United States Capitol. And all the faces I'm looking at, I believe, were part of helping me figure out how to not sound completely discordant in that moment, because we had to acknowledge that we had just had essentially a rule of law crisis ourselves. And we spoke about it very directly, and my message, because I believed it to be true, was that at the end of the day, after January 6th, the rule of law did prevail. We had a free and fair election. We had challenges brought in independent courts with transparent proceedings that were open to a free press. And at the end of the day, on January 6th, our Congress went back into session, as our system of laws compelled them to do, and certified the results of the free and fair election that we had had. And that in the end was a triumph of the rule of law. A difficult day for our country, to be sure. But in the end, the institutions of the rule of law prevailed. And that should give, I hope, all of us here some comfort in the midst of all the challenges between the pandemic and the racial equity issues and the rule of law issues and the election that we went through. Seeing our institutions do their jobs was, at least for this lawyer, deeply comforting.
Yep. That was an extraordinary triumph for our country. The fact that the courts across the states, both state courts and federal courts, unanimously found that the evidence of free and fair election was dispositive of the claims that it was not, in fact, a free and fair election. But as we all know, the fact that many millions of Americans still believe that they were improprieties or unlawful votes in the election it remains a challenge for the rule of law, doesn't it? Because to the extent that the American public loses confidence in the courts as the final arbiter of these contested issues, then there's the stress in the rule of law in the country.
Which goes to the concern that there is now a question of of what are the facts and this question of trust in institutions. And I'm afraid all we can do is to work the institutions and show that they're working and continue to support them. And unfortunately we're looking at a large part of the population that isn't accepting that. And I don't know where the solution to that goes for just humble lawyers, but we certainly it's almost easier as a lawyer who tries things in court because the facts are as the court finds them. We have a decision on what the facts are once it goes through our system, but so much that's in the public, it's a matter of public discussion is now being challenged. That's a broader issue than I think the rule. That's a broader issue than rule of law, although it hurts the rule of law.
Right. The marketplace of ideas never imagined social media.
Yeah, truly. You just can't believe everything you read on the internet, I guess. That's it. Of all the issues that we're facing, are they? Do you think this issue of polarization is this a greater risk, a greater threat than what we see from the autocracies abroad that are putting individual lawyers in a position where they can either do their jobs or face serious consequences? Where the greater risks lie?
I'm not crazy about a hierarchy because I think there are plenty of risks, and rank ordering them makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But, you know, one of the things that we aren't doing very well right now, at least in lots of parts of the world, is just listening to one another. We've lost the ability to sit down and have a conversation with someone who has a different view than we do. And we jump immediately to assumptions that if you're a this or a that, depending on one's political viewpoint, you must be a bad person, which is just a horrific way, whether you think of it from the standpoint of human dignity or you think of it from the standpoint of the rule of law. It's a horrible way for a society to operate. It's an even more horrible way for a government and elected officials in a government to behave. Lawyers can model perfectly how to manage those situations. What do we do for a living? We fight with people, fight in quotes, whether it's in a courtroom or it's over a transaction negotiation or fill in the blank. What lawyers do is advocate in favor of something to another person who needs to be persuaded, and then listen to the reverse. And every one of us knows that the lawyers who are on the other side of our cases or our transactions or whatever they are often fabulously wonderful people who become our dear friends. And we know how to fight during the day and go out for a beer after work, or we used to know how to do that before the pandemic. So I think lawyers are uniquely situated to help our countries move back to a place where you can sit down and actually have a civil disagreement about a matter of policy and see if you can reach compromise. And if not, at least go away agreeing to disagree, but secure in the knowledge that the person you've just talked with is a good person with the best interests of whatever the issue is at hand in his or her heart, and not an evil human being. That would be a start, wouldn't it?
You're here. I would also note that, these kinds of arguments and discussions, particularly in sort of the personal realm, are a process, right? Nobody convinces, or rarely ever convinces, somebody else of the wrong-headedness of their argument in one conversation. The idea is to gain the respect of the individual in such a way that they may continue to think about what you said and come back to you with conversation, picking up where you left off, and the same for you for their ideas. And again, I think lawyers are all about process, and things take time, and lawyers are very good at following process and being patient with due process in the legal setting. And I think there's sort of a due process in the interpersonal setting as well, that if we take heart that at least we have the other person's attention, we may have an opportunity to persuade each other over time, which is really what progress is about ultimately.
Trish, you remind me, I haven't been in a courtroom in a long time, but some of the best friends I ever made in the law that remain friends to this day are opponents in cases, and often the very competent, able lawyers on the other side, the toughest lawyers, the toughest opponents turn out to be, after the case was tried and or settled, became the best friends. But your comments and Mike's comments remind us that certainly a point of unison for the American public should be the ability to rely on the courts to be an impartial arbiter of the facts. After all, the courts attempt to produce justice, but it really depends upon the ability to discern the truth in a dispute based upon evidence that's corroborated in the court. It's the glue that can bind us together, apart from our belief in the ideals of the country. Nonetheless, the belief in and trust in the law, in our courts and the legal process to resolve these thorny issues should be reinforced, because that can help our country see its way clear through these difficult times.
Right, and to the extent you're talking about a jury trial, you're talking about the foundational sort of American principle that the wisdom of the many is better than the wisdom of the one, and that the community can come together to help resolve, whether it's a criminal case or a civil dispute, that 8 or 10 or 12, depending on where you are, of your fellow, citizens can come together to help you, if you're the litigant, figure out the answer to this problem on behalf of our community. That is yet another foundational rule of law principle, at least for us in our country, right?
What strikes me, when we see the politics and the controversy around Supreme Court nominations and other federal appointments, that's probably not the best look for what we hope to achieve. But if you look at the run of the mill, if you look at most cases that come out of most courts, you don't have the same kind of controversy that you see at the highest level of the courts. Over the mine run of cases, the courts work extraordinarily well with incredible reliability, almost predictability, if you will. It's only on the margins that we have the more difficult issues, and then the focus becomes, well, it's a conservative decision or a liberal decision. But even Justice Breyer, I thought it was an insightful comment when he said that he thought that having different opinions on the court in a country of 300 million people seems to be perfectly reasonable and acceptable, that you would expect to see different opinions given the makeup of our population. And in the end, knock on wood, we have seen, and again, we go back to January 6th and the number of decisions where the courts resolved the issue consistently. And I would hope to think that that for the most part our courts are held in high regard and it ought to be. If going back to the threats that we've seen and we've talked about regarding the rule of law, can you, do you have any opinion as to what types of responses or might be more effective than others? We've heard a number discussed here today. We've talked about efforts to create better infrastructure. We've heard about efforts where the ABA president's engaged both foreign governments and others to address rule of law issues. And we've seen from Michael talking about how you put a light on issues and render support, and that can have some positive results. Can you say that any one tool can be more effective than another, or does everything depend on the matter at hand, on the situation at hand? I throw that out to all of you.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Alberto and Mike on this one because they have the vastly more on the ground experience than I do.
Joe, my sense increasingly is that the rule of law is a system of systems, and it's difficult to really have I think a meaningful impact on the quality of the total rule of law by just focusing on a narrow element of that. I touched on the challenge that corruption poses globally as an example of that. Recently, Trish has been involved in some of these cases at our request. She sent letters seeking to urge foreign governments to pay attention to the judicial selection process in the country, and certainly that's part of it. A judiciary with integrity and professionalism is in many ways the last line of defense for the rule of law in any country, not just ours, as was demonstrated after the January 6th series of litigation. But the law schools and the tenor and what they teach their students in becoming lawyers is important, and the Bar Association is critically important. The Bar Association can play a critical role in holding its lawyers accountable for following the standards of ethics and professionalism, and helping police its own memberships. They have an important role to play as well in helping abate corruption and maintaining fidelity to the rule of law in individual countries. So, and then of course, popular support for the rule of law, which is more of a political question than a legal question, is critically important as well, because the public needs to organize in defense of the rule of law in countries. So increasingly at Rowley, we're seeing this as a system, and we're asking ourselves the question, how can we help our partners overseas work with the entire system? And then of course within that, then how do you focus your attention on a particular element?
Yeah, I would just add to that, picking up on the last point in particular, that I think from my perspective, and I think it's fair for most of our staff probably, that if you want to boil it down to one thing, that if you had to pick one thing that may be the most important over time, it's for the legal profession to be vocal, and vocal consistently. Because I think the bottom line is that change toward a more positive embrace of the rule of law comes from within a country and within a society. And that again requires advocacy. And it's usually a very few number who are willing to put it all on the line to do that kind of advocacy. And then we see, if it's effective, we can often see popular protest evolve from that. And that often can produce change over time. But you know, when the American Bar Association and presidents, Trish on back through history, have issued rule of law letters, for example, or public statements about a government's malfeasance on human rights and rule of law, it's rarely ever with any expectation that you're going to change the government's behavior. Maybe you will temporarily, maybe there'll be some sort of marginal change. But what you're really ultimately doing is showing the advocates in that country, get the word of that kind of advocacy, that the president of the American Bar Association is paying attention. The entire ABA, the American legal profession and all that stands for, is paying attention to what that advocate is doing and to what that government is doing to that advocate in response. And the more that the American Bar Association and groups like the organizers, our partner groups for this webathon, do that consistently and repeatedly and often as appropriate, you got to see the advocates take courage from that and continue their advocacy. And that has, from my perspective, the greatest long-term promise of change.
And I don't disagree with that. I think the spotlight that you're given for a year as president of the American Bar Association is deeply important. And I consider it, frankly, sacred. I mean, it's that important. And so folks understand, much to my chagrin, the American Bar Association president does not just get to say what she thinks on stuff, on any topic. I don't even think I would probably get yelled at if I said that, you know, my favorite flavor of LaCroix water was grapefruit. That would be considered a sin.
Is there policy for that?
The point is that the American Bar Association president speaks only on matters as to which there is formal policy. And that's a very important difference, I think, sometimes that we have here as opposed to our colleagues in bar associations elsewhere. And it's there for an important reason, which is that the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association is controlled by and is a creature of the state and local bars of the United States. So what that means is that when the president of the ABA does speak, he or she really is speaking as the national voice of America's legal profession, because that's where the policy derives, is from the state and local bars of our country. So on matters relating to international human rights issues, needless to say, it is not my day job to be expert in those matters, but the folks that I'm looking at here on this panel all are. And I rely on them almost every week on something, because there is an issue that requires, as Mike said, the attention of the president and requires the president to say something. And there's a whole range of things that the president can do, right? The president can issue a formal statement of some kind. The president can craft a formal letter to a government or a minister of a government in a foreign country. That's sort of on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, I can tweet like almost everybody else, or cause tweets, more truthfully, cause tweets to happen. And those too can be impactful. On issues that are smaller is not the right word, that you have to triage, what I'm trying to say, the issues. And some merit a more formal response and others merit a less formal response, but something to be said anyway, to Mike's point of just saying, we're watching, just so you know, we're watching. And another important piece that we haven't talked about, but that I actually think belongs in this mix, is the awards that the American Bar Association gives. The folks that the American Bar Association formally recognizes with, whether it's the Eleanor Roosevelt, Prize or the Human Rights Award, there are any number of those awards, if you will, that we give every year that make a significant difference in the lives of other lawyers doing amazing work in some very dark places around this globe. And we're proud of that work as well.
I'm really glad you brought up the awards, because I don't think anyone had mentioned that before. And I thank you. I thank you for that. That does speak that speaks volumes. It really does speak volumes when the ABA gives an award to a human rights defender or a lawyer who has ended up being at risk for doing their work. Could you, if where there is policy, I mean, clearly there are many things that happen every day, but no one expects this association or the president or any association to, as we said before, play whack-a-mole, attempting to address every wrong. What are the kinds of issues that we look at in order, with respect to rule of law issues, saying, okay, this is something where we're speaking out, or something we're going to watch before we speak out, or we're going to let other people in the association address that through their programs and policies. What are the kinds of things that we ought to be thinking about when we look at these issues?
So here's a real specific example. It's a domestic example, not an international one, and then I'll come to the international. When the Capitol was under attack on May 6th, I didn't ask anybody to go look for a policy passed by the House of Delegates that said it's bad to attack the United States Capitol building. I just said, I'm going to assume on this one that I'm okay in, cloaking this in general rule of law principles. And I did. The farther from home it gets, and the more specific the particular issue gets, the more I'm asking questions around what exactly do we have with respect to policy on this particular point. And Alberto and Mike and others on their teams, and often Joe on the international law sections teams, are coming to me and saying, here's our policy, or here's the more broad policy that we think encompasses your ability to speak to these issues. And we talk it through. And sometimes there'll be a question of timing, whether this is the right moment for us to say something, or whether things are sufficiently, unstable, is that the right word, or in flux, that we would do better to wait a little while. Sometimes there are timing issues. Sometimes there are questions about circumstances in a particular country that we might unintentionally make worse if we speak to something either in the wrong way or at the wrong time. And we try very hard to be conscious of those factors as well. And sometimes, in one instance I can recall in particular, since I've been president, there was just a flat out disagreement between Camp A and Camp B. And I had to listen to everybody from Camp A say their piece and everybody from Camp B say their piece, and ask some more questions and make the best judgment that I could about what the right thing was to do. But that's only happened once.
And those are difficult calls.
Exactly.
Difficult calls. And it's what's the right way to do it? And then are there other ways to achieve the same kind of objective, which is what's the best tool to try to achieve the same objective? Joe, when you mentioned the issue about awards, what comes to mind, and Mike can talk about this, was the award that the Center for Human Rights gave to what is a very distinguished group of LGBT advocates. So a couple of years ago, he gave the Eleanor Roosevelt Award to really what were the 5 or 6 top lawyers in the United States for 50 years leading the legal charge on behalf of rights, and to kind of take inventory of what had been accomplished with significant ABA help along the way was a marvelous occasion for the rule of law. I don't know, Mike, if you want to comment on that award.
Sure. Thanks, Alberto. Yeah, real quick, I just wanted to really emphasize 2 things that Trish said first. One is that it's ABA policy that makes it all the ABA doing the thing. And so without policy, it can't nor should it be done. Number one. Number 2, the ABA speaks with a voice that's legal, if you will. It's about the law, as distinct from other advocacy organizations, which are usually law-based, but have sort of a much more name and shame or finger wagging kind of approach. That's not the ABA approach, nor should it be. And I think it's effective, very effective in its unique kind of voice. But yeah, Alberto, back in 2018, the Center for Human Rights conferred its first Eleanor Roosevelt Prize for Global Human Rights Advancement to Hillary Rodham Clinton and to Ben Ferencz. With the blessing of the Roosevelt family, we named the award after her as the indispensable champion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's why you see her behind me here. Last year, we honored, or I should say in 2019, as Alberto mentioned, we also worked with the Roosevelt House in New York, which was where Eleanor and Franklin started their political careers. We honored, I guess, the ACLU, Lambda Legal, and Kai Feldblum for their work over 50 years collectively in advancing the rights domestically and elsewhere of LGBTQ individuals. And it was the way they react to both the ABA issuing the honor and doing so legitimately in Eleanor Roosevelt's name is quite a thing to behold, and it's quite gratifying. And so it's still a very new award, but one that is really gaining some traction, and we've been very proud to be able to honor the folks we've honored to date. And Trish, I should say, in 2020, everything was virtual. And we honored Dr. Anthony Fauci, Billie Jean King, and Iranian human rights lawyer Nasreen Sotoudeh for her work. And we try to peg the awards to thematic ideas. And in 2019, it was about the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and that's the LGBTQ theme. Before that, it was the UDHR's 70th anniversary. And last year in 2020, it was about the pandemic, and it was about Nasreen Sotoudeh's work in Iran. And it was also the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States and women's empowerment. And so that's why Billie Jean King was honored.
Well, and if I can just say that Nasreen Sotoudeh is one of the, I mean, the other two awardees were extraordinary and I take nothing from them, but this woman has devoted her career to women's rights and human rights in Iran. She's an extraordinary human being, an extraordinary lawyer, and watching her video of acceptance, which was in Farsi, except for where she said, Trish Refo. Bless her heart. That was the most impactful thing. I'm trying to share what it meant to me, that I couldn't be there to give her this award in person, but that she cared enough to say my name is a moment I will remember to my grave, truly.
Yeah, she's something else for sure.
Thank you for telling us that, Trish. And I think I am sure that both Alberto and Mike in their work feel those kinds of satisfaction and thrills when they can find and see tangible positive results. I know our section, our members are thrilled when they're able to make some contribution that is in support of and defense of and advancement of the rule of law. It's late. We are bound to close up at 5 minutes to the hour to make time for the next panel to come forward. So with that, I would like to thank very, very much all of our panelists, President Trish Refo, Alberto Mora, and Michael Pates. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, thanks to Madam Secretary Albright. This is only the fourth panel. You have 8 more to go. The next panel will start at the top of the hour. It'll be presented by the State Bar of California. We're moving to the West Coast, and it will run for the next 2-hour period. And again, on behalf of the American Bar Association, the president of the American Bar Association, Trish Refo, the director of the Rule of Law Initiative, Alberto Mora, and the director of the Center for Human Rights, Michael Pates, and on behalf of the Section of International Law, we thank you all for spending this time with us, and we thank you for participating in this Rule of Law Webathon. Take care all and have a great evening. Bye-bye.